Hey y'all, and welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new. My name is Marissa, and in today's video, we are doing tomatoes 4 different ways. We are preserving tomatoes 4 different ways. And I bought these tomatoes at a farm market, and it's a 25-pound box of Roma tomatoes, and it was $10 because they weren't quite ripe all the way yet, which worked out perfectly because I wasn't able to get to these on the day that we bought them. And so now I'm getting started, and the first thing I'm doing is I'm slicing these Roma tomatoes into thin slices and putting them in the dehydrator, and those will dehydrate for about 24 hours. Depending on how thick or thin you cut them, that time will vary. And my plans are to use those on veggie pizzas. When I make homemade veggie pizzas, you can eat them as like a chip, put it on a charcuterie board and have it as a little snack on the board. Just different ways you can use those chips, tomato chips. Now I am slicing the ends off of these tomatoes in that colander right there. Those tomatoes, that's 8 pounds of Roma tomatoes. And all I'm going to do right here is cut the tips off of them and slice them in half and then fill the crock pot. My plans for these tomatoes is to make homemade tomato paste. And let me go ahead and say, and I've said this before in my other videos, when I preserve tomatoes, I do leave the skin and I leave the seeds. It doesn't bother me. I usually will put them in a blender or use the immersion blender to get them nice and blended up, and it doesn't bother me. And it's, you're using every part of the tomato, not wasting anything. So I'm going to put these in the crock pot, and I set the timer for 20 hours. These will stay in there. I put the lid on it, and I don't mess with them. I may come back and stir them a couple of times, but other than that, I will not mess with them until the 20 hours is up. When you're doing tomato paste, it takes a long time. And this is the first time I am doing tomato paste. So it's an experiment, and you'll see at the end of this video what my thoughts for making your own tomato paste is. But that's 8 pounds of tomatoes in the crock pot, and we're just going to get those, the lid on it, and set the timer for 20 minutes. Okay, so now we are moving on to my third method of preserving these tomatoes. In that colander, there are 5 to 6 pounds of the Roma tomatoes, and I am going to make homemade Rotel out of these tomatoes. If you've ever had Rotel tomatoes from the grocery store, you know that the tomatoes are diced. But almost every time that I use a can of Rotel tomatoes, I end up blending the can up in the blender anyway. I don't like, this is going to sound so strange since I've been canning so many tomato products, but I don't like tomatoes. I do like tomatoes. I mean, I like ketchup and things like that. Obviously, I like spaghetti and all that stuff that you can use tomatoes in, but I do not like the texture of a tomato, and I don't like the raw taste of a tomato. So the only time that I would not blend up a can of Rotel is if we are making what we call cheese soup in our house. It's just Velveeta and Rotel, which is just nacho, a queso dip type thing. But my son used to call it cheese soup when he was a little baby. So anyway, my plan for these tomatoes in making the Rotel is I'm just going to use the emulsion blender, not to blend it up super smooth, but to, leave it a little bit chunky, and then add my poblano peppers to it. And so that's the process, and you'll see that here in just a minute. So that is 3 ways that I am preserving these tomatoes, and I did say there's a fourth, and that is coming up now. After the tomatoes for the tomato paste had cooked for 20 hours in the crock pot, I am going to drain off all of the juices. And that is my fourth way of preserving these tomatoes. The juice, the watery, the liquidy juice that comes off is going to be tomato juice, and I'm going to can it. And then I get juice from both the tomato paste and the Rotel that I'm making. Now, you're fixing to watch me and my husband try our best to not make a mess. And it took us a couple of tries to figure out the best way to do this. I ended up getting a big slotted spoon and just scooped them out into the colander and then poured the rest of the juices over it. That way it was a lot easier and it didn't make as big of a mess. And then I let that sit there for a little while and periodically would go back with a wooden spoon and just move those tomatoes around, trying to get out as much juice as possible. So now we are moving on to the tomatoes that I'm using for Rotel, and I'm going to do the same thing to these. I'm going to take my big slotted spoon and or scoop, whatever you want to call that thing, and I'm going to get all of the tomatoes out and then put the juice in that big camera that I was draining the other tomatoes in. Here you can see what I mentioned earlier about just moving those tomatoes around, trying to get out as much of the juice as possible. And then I put those tomatoes back into the crock pot, and you will see the huge difference. I mean, when I started with this 8 pounds of tomatoes, they were at the top of the crock pot, and now this just barely covers the bottom. But I do put it back into the crock pot, and I leave the lid off and continue to cook it because I want any of the water, any of the liquid left in it to evaporate out of it. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just getting out as much as I can, and then I'm going to put this back in the crock pot. So now I am getting all of the juice from the Rotel tomatoes, and I am going to strain them into this Cambro. And there are some chunky pieces of tomato bits, and I try to get off as much of that as I can, but there are some that end up in the tomato juice, and that is just fine because I will be using that tomato juice in soups and stews and stuff like that. So all those little extra pieces are just extra flavor. Is anyone else like me? I burn up in the kitchen. I'm at that stage of life where I burn up all the time, if you know what I mean. And so having a fan in the kitchen, especially while canning, is a huge must for me. So now I am going to get my poblanos ready for the rotel, and these are poblanos. I did not grow these. I am growing poblano peppers out in my garden, but mine were still too small, and so I had to get some of these from the grocery store. But before I finish chopping these, I remembered that I needed to get the immersion blender going in my tomatoes. And like I said, I'm not going to make it super smooth. I am going to leave it a little bit chunky. So now I will continue to cut up these poblano peppers, and I do try to get them as tiny in tiny diced pieces because I don't, like I said, I don't like the chunkiness of Rotel unless we put it into the cheese soup that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to get these as chopped as finely as I can and get that into the pot. And then I'm just going to cook this down for a little bit longer to get, if there's any extra water in the tomatoes, I want to get that cooked out of it. So I will cook, I think I brought it to a boil and then let it simmer for, I think, around 20 to 30 minutes. I just think that looks so beautiful. The red and the green together. And then I am going to add a few seasonings to it. I add salt, pepper. I believe I did garlic powder and onion powder. And then I also did a few minced onions. I do not measure my spices. I just kind of, well, I guess you can say I measure with my heart because I just eyeball it and see what looks good. And again, I'm going to bring this up to a boil and then I will turn the heat down and simmer it for about 20 to 30 minutes. And now we are moving on to the tomato juice. I ended up with 3 quarts of tomato juice, and I am going to fill these up to a 1/2 inch headspace. And I do add a tablespoon of lemon juice to these jars. And then I'm just going to get these ready and wipe the rims and get the lids on and get them in the water bath canner, just waiting to get more things into the canner here in just a little bit. There was a moment while I was doing these tomatoes, it might have been right here, canning up this tomato juice, that I scratched my eye, or I did something with my eye. And even though I had washed my fingers and I really didn't think the poblano peppers were that hot, oh my word, my eye started burning. And my husband had to come in and we got rinsed it out, got a wet rag and put it on my eye. It was super painful. I mean, I've done that before, but I've done that with jalapeno peppers. I've never done it with a poblano pepper. But yeah, good times. And now I'm back just checking on my Rotel. I do jump around in this video from one thing to another because it's kind of how the process went for me. This took place over the course of 2 days, actually just 2 evenings. It probably took a couple hours each evening to get all of this finished. And so right here, I am taking off some of I'm checking my tomatoes that I'm dehydrating, and you see how they are. I think I might show you a close up here in just a little bit, but yeah, these turned out amazing. I was super thrilled with these, and I cannot wait to make a homemade pizza. The way I like to make my homemade veggie pizza is my homemade crust, and I use olive oil and garlic, and that is like my sauce. And then I will top it with tomatoes, zucchini, and I'm going to dry some zucchini as well, and then peppers and onions, and that is my favorite veggie pizza. So I'm looking forward to using these tomatoes to do that. I'm also going to rotate my trays around. Some of these were finished, and that looks beautiful right there, I think. But some of them still had some drying out to do. If it had any moisture, any stickiness to it, I left it on the dehydrator, and then I just periodically go in and I will rotate my trays. So now I am finally ready to jar up my Rotel. I end up getting a baker's dozen. I get 13 8-ounce jars, and that's pretty much all we need at a time when we use it. So I think the recipe that I found online actually called for 12-ounce jars. I don't have 12-ounce jars, although that would be beautiful, I think. I think those jars are so pretty. But I didn't have any, so I'm just using the 8-ounce jars, and I used the process time the same as the 12-ounce would have taken, which I think was 35 minutes. And so I'm going to put a tablespoon of lemon juice in each jar, and then I'm just going to get busy filling these up. I think I have said it in every canning video so far. I love to can. I love to process foods in different ways. I love having this on the shelf, in the off season when we need it. And I love the fact that I know exactly what is in the jars. There's no word in the ingredient list that I can't pronounce. And it's all fresh, and it just makes me happy. It makes me smile to do this and to have these things. And I just feel truly blessed. I think God has truly blessed us. Always remember to debubble and wipe your rims. I use vinegar to wipe and clean my rims. And I always make a mess with stuff like this. So just if you're like me and you make big messes, just make sure you clear that lid, that rim off really well, because you do not want anything left on there to kind of hinder the sealing when it seals. And then I have my lids and my rings soaking in very hot water. I always do that no matter what. When I water bath can, I just like the added protection that it gives. And then I'm going to get these jars in the canner. There's 13, and I thought that I would have enough room with my tomato juices in there to get all of those jars in. I ended up not having enough room, so I do take the tomato juice out and process the Rotel for 35 minutes, and then I don't add, I just put the 3-quart jars of tomato juice in there, and I canned those by themselves, and they did just fine. I processed those for 45 minutes, the tomato juice for 45 minutes. If I had been able to get both the Rotel and the tomato juice in the canner together, then I would have used the longest process time to process this, which would have been the 45 minutes, which is what the tomato juice called for. So now we are moving back to the tomato paste. I get all of the tomatoes out of the crock pot, and I'm putting it into this measuring cup because there was not enough tomatoes when using the immersion blender, there was not enough tomatoes to cover the blade with the immersion blender, so it was slinging tomatoes everywhere. So I put them in this bowl, and all I do is I just use the immersion blender to make them as smooth as I possibly can. And while after I do this, I could have water. I could have canned. Is what I'm trying to say. The tomato paste. I did find a recipe where there was a process time, 4-ounce jars or even 8-ounce jars. There just wasn't enough at the end of it. There was not enough for me to do that to make it worth it. So I'm going to freeze them. And I have some freezer trays that I used when I was making my grandbaby's homemade baby food. And I'm going to use those trays. I did lose the footage of me filling up those trays, but this is the tray, and I ended up with a full tray and a half. And then I'm going to get those in the freezer and get those ready to freeze. Now we're moving on. It's time to get the Rotel out of the canner. These turned out so beautiful. I am so thrilled with this. I haven't used it yet. I did give it a little taste before I put it in the jars, and it's good. I'm excited to use these. And now we are moving on to the tomato paste. It has been 24 hours since I had put those in the freezer. I'm just going to pop them out of these little trays. I think on the other tray I had to run a little bit of hot water underneath just to help pop them out. But they're little silicone trays, super easy to use. And I'm so glad that I tried this. I mean, it was a process and an experience, something I had never tried before. And to be honest, I probably won't do it again. There's just not enough bang for your buck when it comes to this. And so this right here, those little pucks, I get 18 little pucks. It's about a tablespoon per puck. And that started out as 8 pounds of tomatoes. So yes, it was fun. Was it worth it cost wise? Probably not. So I'm just going to get these in a bag. I'm going to label my bag and get them in the freezer to use in future dishes. All right, y'all, here is the final product of the 25, well, I guess I shouldn't say final because I still have those, but 25 pounds of Roma tomatoes. I got the box for $10 because they weren't ripe all the way. Of course, now they are. I got 3 bottles, 3 quart jars of tomato juice. I got I would probably say if I packed this in, it'd be 1 pint of the dehydrated tomatoes. And right now my brain is to put these on a homemade veggie pizza, but if you've got other ideas, I'm sure they're out there. If you want to eat them just as a chip, I guess you could do that too, but these turned out really well. I got 13 8-ounce jars of homemade Rotel, and I got 18 tablespoons of tomato paste that will go in my freezer. Now, I will say this. I'm glad that I tried it. I'm glad I gave it a go to try to make my own tomato paste. However, the time that it takes to do it, the process, this right here started out as 8 pounds of tomatoes. Let that sink in for a minute. This was 8 pounds of tomatoes. Now, I did get a jar of tomato juice out of it too, but still, 1 quart jar and 18 tablespoons of tomato paste. I will probably buy that from now on, unless you guys have a better idea of how to do it and make it more bang for your buck. And then I still have about 8 pounds of tomatoes left over, and I haven't really decided what I'm going to do with that. I better decide soon. I think I'm going to go ahead and roast them, and they may just turn into tomato sauce. I haven't really decided yet, so we'll see. But that is it. Tomatoes 4 different ways. Thanks, guys, for hanging out. I'll see you next time. Bye.